Life changes in moments we least expect, and sometimes the people we trust the most become the very reason we break. The story of how I was replaced without warning is not just about betrayal, but about the silence that hurts louder than words. When Elias Verdun, a man who built his world on loyalty and love, found himself suddenly pushed aside, he uncovered secrets that twisted everything he thought he knew. Each step forward drew him deeper into a storm of lies, leaving him torn between heartbreak and the urge for truth. Elias Verdun always believed that silence was a comfortable thing, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around him like a soft blanket after long days of noise. But lately, that silence had shifted. It wasn't soothing anymore. It was sharp, heavy, and filled with an emptiness he couldn't explain. It was in the way conversations with people close to him had grown shorter, in the way laughter felt strained, and in the subtle pauses that lingered longer than they should. Elias wasn't a man prone to paranoia, yet there was something different, something unsettling, like the faintest crack spreading across glass. At first, he told himself he was imagining it, that people simply got tired, busy, or distracted. After all, life had its rhythms, and perhaps this was just one of them. But the unease clung to him, whispering in places where there should have been peace. He began noticing little things that unsettled him. Messages that once carried warmth were reduced to cold fragments, replies delayed with excuses that didn't quite add up. Meetings that used to feel natural and necessary started to get postponed without warning, often brushed aside with explanations that seemed rehearsed. Elias felt himself slipping to the sidelines, though no one said it outright. It was as if he had gone from being at the center of a shared world to standing in its shadows, watching it carry on without him. Every smile seemed dimmer, every greeting a little thinner, as though someone had quietly erased the comfort from his connections. Elias tried to reason with himself, convincing his mind to let go of these feelings. He told himself that distance was normal, that people needed space, that not everything revolved around him. But the quiet unease crept into his sleep, filling his nights with restless thoughts. He found himself replaying conversations in his mind, dissecting words for hidden meanings, remembering tones that felt unusually flat. He caught himself waiting for the warmth that once came easily but no longer arrived. The strangest part was that nobody had said anything. Nobody had confessed to pulling away. Yet the distance was undeniable. It was in their eyes when they looked at him, eyes that no longer held the same spark of familiarity. There were moments when Elias felt foolish, wondering if he was creating problems where none existed. He had always been someone who carried his heart open, someone who believed in the honesty of bonds, and the thought of being wrong about what he was feeling gnawed at him. Yet deep inside, he knew there was truth in his unease. He recognized it in the silence after his words, in the way his presence no longer seemed necessary, as if the air around him had already shifted to make space for someone else. It was like watching a play where his role had been written out, but he had not yet been told. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine, smiling when the weight in his chest grew heavier, laughing when the echo of his laughter felt hollow, nodding along in conversations where he was no longer truly seen. Elias carried the weight of suspicion quietly, afraid that speaking it aloud would make it real, that naming the distance would confirm his worst fear, that he was no longer wanted. So he chose silence too, though his silence was born of dread rather than comfort. He told himself it was temporary, that the warmth would return, that he simply had to endure this strange season. Still, every day, the signs grew sharper. Friends who once leaned on him now found excuses to avoid him. Small traditions they had kept together were suddenly forgotten, replaced with new patterns he wasn't included in. Even the simplest gestures, the smile of greeting, the casual touch on the shoulder, faded until they vanished altogether. Elias began to realize he was clinging to ghosts of what once was, shadows of intimacy that had already dissolved. And though no one had said it, though no voice had declared his place taken, he could feel the truth pressing against him in every empty glance, in every silence that lingered just a moment too long. Elias Verdun stood in the middle of his life, sensing the shift but unable to name it, terrified of what it would mean if he did. And in that fragile space where suspicion and denial collided, he felt the first pangs of something far worse than loneliness, the slow unraveling of trust, the beginning of being replaced without a word. The moment came without warning, as if the ground had been yanked out from beneath Elias Verdun's feet. One day he was still clinging to the fragile hope that the distance was temporary, convincing himself that things would fall back into place, and the next he found himself staring at the undeniable truth. He had been replaced. There was no confrontation, no explanation, no words spoken to ease the sharpness of the wound. It arrived in silence as so much of the change had, but this time the silence was cruel. It was a gathering he had always been part of, one of those small rituals that carried a sense of belonging. For years, his presence was as natural as breathing in that space. He walked into the room with a faint nervousness in his chest, hoping for the comfort of familiarity, but what he found stopped him cold. There, in the place where he should have been, stood another, a face unfamiliar yet firmly positioned, laughter spilling easily from lips that had already claimed the circle Elias once thought was his. His seat was no longer his role no longer needed. He hadn't been asked to step aside, he simply found that the space had closed around someone else. The sting wasn't in the act itself, but in the ease with which it happened. The others welcomed the replacement so naturally, as though the transition had been rehearsed long before Elias arrived to witness it. They smiled at this new presence the way they used to smile at him, their gestures fluid, unhesitant, without even the faintest acknowledgement of what had been taken away. Elias stood there, an outsider looking in, as if his very existence had been edited out of a story he had once believed he was writing. His chest tightened as questions swirled in his mind, questions that had no answers. When had the decision been made? Had they planned it all along? Was it something he had done, or something he had failed to do, that made him so easily replaced? The weight of betrayal settled into his bones, heavy and unrelenting, not because of confrontation but because of the absence of it. They had not even offered him the dignity of an explanation. It was as though he had been erased quietly, his worth diminished in silence. Elias tried to mask the storm within him. He forced a smile, forced himself to stand tall, though inside he felt stripped of something sacred. Every laugh that echoed in the room cut through him like glass. Every moment of connection between them and the stranger was a reminder that he no longer belonged. The world moved on around him, unaffected, while he remained rooted in disbelief. The night stretched painfully, every second drawing him deeper into the realization. They didn't look at him the way they used to. Their eyes lingered on the replacement instead, finding in that new presence the spark that once connected them to him. And the worst part was how seamlessly it all fit together, as if Elias had never mattered at all. His existence was fading from their story, and he was forced to watch as it happened, powerless to stop it. Later, when he was alone, the silence returned. But it was different now. It wasn't heavy with suspicion as it had been before. It was hollow, echoing with absence. Elias sat in the stillness, the image of that night carved into his mind. He replayed every detail, every glance, every careless gesture that confirmed his displacement. He couldn't escape the truth that gnawed at him. He had been replaced without warning, cast aside without reason. And while the world seemed unchanged, his own had fractured in a way he could not repair. The betrayal wasn't just in losing his place. It was in how invisible the loss was to everyone else. Elias Verdun had always known that silence could hide truths, but he never expected it to conceal so many layers of betrayal. After that night, when the sting of being replaced had carved itself deep into his chest, he found himself restless, unable to settle, unable to accept what had happened, without knowing why. The questions gnawed at him endlessly. Why had he been pushed aside? Who had decided it was time for him to vanish from the circle he thought he belonged to? And most importantly, how long had they all been preparing to erase him while he stood there blind? At first, Elias tried to bury the curiosity under his grief, telling himself that sometimes people simply drift apart. But the thought wouldn't leave him. It sat in his chest like a thorn, sharper with every passing day. He began paying closer attention to the smallest details, retracing steps, conversations and gestures that now seemed more sinister in hindsight. The truth, he suspected, was not as simple as being forgotten. Something deliberate had happened, and though no one would speak of it openly, the silence itself began to reveal cracks. It started with overheard whispers. Elias hadn't meant to listen, but when his name was spoken in hushed tones, his body froze on instinct. He stood just out of sight, his breath held, as two voices he once trusted muttered about things they had sworn they'd never reveal. Words like "finally" and "better this way" cut him sharper than any blade. He pieced together fragments that didn't fit at first, mentions of plans made months ago, of someone waiting in the wings long before Elias even felt the first signs of distance. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't sudden at all. The replacement had been planned, his erasure decided long before he noticed the cracks. The betrayal deepened when he stumbled across a message left open on a table, its glow spilling secrets that were never meant for him to see. He hadn't gone searching. The words found him. His name was there, dissected coldly, his loyalty questioned, his worth dismissed as though he were nothing more than a placeholder. They had spoken of him not as a friend, not as someone who mattered, but as an obstacle to be cleared. The casual cruelty in those words sent Elias's heart spiraling, not only because of their content, but because of the people behind them, the very ones he thought would defend him. Every discovery pulled him deeper into a darkness he hadn't imagined. The smiles he had once trusted, the gestures of warmth he once believed in, now seemed like masks hiding sharper intentions. Elias began to see the truth in every detail. The meetings he hadn't been invited to, the inside jokes that slipped past him, the way conversations halted when he entered the room. It was all part of a careful unraveling. Each thread pulled until he was left hanging alone. The cruelest truth was not just that he had been replaced, but that those who replaced him had been preparing for it long before he realized it. They had built a new foundation beneath his feet, and when it was strong enough, they pulled the ground out from under him without hesitation. What broke Elias wasn't the act itself, but the knowledge that he had been living among lies, blind to the shifting loyalties around him. His trust had been fed to whispers and secrets until nothing of it remained. And yet hidden in the ache of betrayal was something else, an unsettling realization that there was more he hadn't uncovered. The whispers, the messages, the strange looks, they all hinted at deeper motives, reasons cloaked in shadows he hadn't yet touched. Elias knew that if he had uncovered this much without trying, then there were darker truths still buried, truths that would change not just how he saw them, but how he saw himself. The silence was no longer heavy, it was dangerous. Elias Verdun could no longer contain the storm inside him. The hidden truths had cut too deep, each discovery like a shard of glass lodged beneath his skin. For days he carried them in silence, his mind replaying the whispers, the words written in messages that treated him like nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared away. At first he thought he could endure it, thought he could remain quiet and protect what was left of his dignity, but the weight became unbearable. The questions needed answers, the anger needed a voice. The betrayal demanded a confrontation. It began quietly. Elias approached one of them, someone he once trusted without hesitation. His voice trembled at first, not from fear, but from the rawness of everything he held back for so long. He asked simple questions, direct but calm, hoping against all hope that there might be an explanation that would soften the wound. Yet what he received was not clarity but evasion. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes, words that deflected, excuses so thin they only deepened the truth. And in that moment, Elias understood something far more painful. They weren't interested in defending themselves, because in their hearts, they had already let him go. The confrontation escalated when Elias demanded more, when his voice broke through the false calm, when the sharpness in his tone exposed just how deeply he had been hurt. That was when the mask slipped. What had been whispers behind his back now spilled out before him, blunt and merciless. He was told he had been holding them back, that his place was no longer needed, that the replacement was simply better. Each word was a dagger, not because of its truth, but because of the ease with which it was spoken. They hadn't struggled with the betrayal. They hadn't mourned the loss of him. They had already moved on, and now they wanted him to understand it as if it were some rational decision. Elias's chest burned with the weight of those words. He had imagined betrayal as something sharp and sudden, a strike that left you breathless. But this was worse. It was betrayal delivered with calm faces and steady voices, as though what they had done to him was not cruelty, but necessity. They looked at him not with guilt, but with a strange mixture of pity and irritation, as though his pain was an inconvenience, as though he should have already accepted his own erasure. In the days that followed, Elias confronted more of them, unable to stop himself from searching for someone, anyone, who might still hold him with the loyalty he once believed unshakable. But each confrontation unraveled another layer of betrayal. Some admitted it openly, shrugging as though he should have seen it coming. Others denied it outright, but their eyes betrayed them, darting away, unable to meet his gaze. Worst of all were the ones who remained silent, whose refusal to speak was louder than any confession. Silence had always been a part of Elias's life, but now it screamed louder than words, a wall between him and the truth he no longer needed to hear. With every confrontation, the circle around him grew colder, tighter, and more unyielding. Elias realized he had not only been replaced, he had been exiled. The very act of seeking answers branded him as the problem. His questions turned against him as proof that he was unworthy of belonging. The more he searched for truth, the deeper the betrayal became, until he understood there was no one left who stood with him. The irony was not lost on him. He had entered the confrontations hoping to reclaim some shred of honesty, but instead he had unearthed betrayals darker than he could have imagined. They hadn't just replaced him, they had rewritten the story to make it seem as though he had never been a part of it. His memories, his loyalty, his sacrifices, all of it had been scrubbed away, replaced by a narrative where he was unnecessary from the beginning. Elias walked away from those confrontations with more than just pain. He carried a hollow ache where trust had once lived, and in its place grew something sharper. He knew now that the betrayal was complete, that there was no going back, no repairing what had been torn apart. The faces that once meant safety now haunted him, every smile a reminder of the lies they had hidden behind. He could no longer pretend, he could no longer hope, and yet, deep within him, beyond the grief, beyond the despair, something darker began to stir, a quiet, dangerous resolve. Elias Verdon stood in the ruins of what used to be his world, surrounded by the ashes of trust and belonging. The confrontations had given him no peace, only wounds that cut deeper each time he reached for honesty and found betrayal instead. Everywhere he turned there was silence where once there had been laughter, coldness where once there had been warmth. He had not simply lost his place, he had been pushed out of it, erased and left to stumble through the emptiness of a life that no longer seemed his own. And yet within that emptiness, a question took root, one that clawed at him in every waking moment. What should he do now? The question came like a shadow, always present, waiting for him when he opened his eyes in the morning and when he lay restless at night. Should he walk away, swallowing the bitterness, letting them carry on as though he had never mattered? Or should he strike back, let his pain forge into something sharp, something that could make them feel even a fraction of the agony they had carved into him? It was not just a choice of paths, it was a battle for his very soul. Revenge whispered first, loud and tempting. Elias could almost hear its voice in the corners of his mind, telling him that justice lay not in silence but in fire. He imagined their faces when the truths they hid were dragged into the light, when their secrets were exposed, when the world saw them for who they really were. He thought of tearing down the fragile web they had built, brick by brick, until nothing remained of the place that had once cast him aside. The fantasy was intoxicating, each detail painted vividly in his imagination. Their shame, their regret, their realization that replacing him had consequences. Revenge promised satisfaction, a balm for his wounds, the illusion that he could reclaim his worth by making them bleed. But acceptance spoke too, softer, almost weary, as though it carried wisdom he was too broken to hear. Acceptance told him that revenge would not heal him, that even if he destroyed them, the hole in his chest would remain. It whispered that peace could only come when he chose to let go, when he stopped searching for answers in the faces that had already turned away. Acceptance urged him to see his own life beyond them, to rebuild himself not in the shadow of betrayal, but in the light of something new, something untouched by their cruelty. It was not a seductive voice, it was patient, distant, almost unreachable in its calm. And yet part of Elias longed for it, longed for the stillness of release. The struggle consumed him. One day he would burn with fury, his hands clenched as he thought of all the ways he could make them suffer. The next he would collapse beneath the weight of his grief, exhausted by the thought of carrying hatred forever. He walked through streets that once held meaning, feeling them stripped of familiarity, feeling himself a ghost among places that no longer welcomed him. Every corner reminded him of what he had lost. Every silence pressed the choice deeper into his chest. He began to test the paths in small ways. Once, he nearly acted on his anger, gathering the evidence he had uncovered, imagining how easily he could scatter it like seeds of ruin. He held the power to unravel them just as they had unraveled him. But at the last moment he froze, realizing that once the fire was set there would be no turning back. Another time, he tried to embrace acceptance, convincing himself he could walk away quietly, telling himself that letting go would make him stronger. But the ache of betrayal clung to him, pulling him back into the storm, reminding him that forgetting was not so simple. Elias stood at the edge of himself, torn between two fates. Revenge offered power but threatened to poison him, turning his pain into chains that would bind him forever. Acceptance offered peace but demanded that he let go of a part of himself he wasn't sure he could release. Both choices carried sacrifice. Both choices would change him. And in the quiet hours when the world slept and only his thoughts remained, Elias felt the truth pressing against him. He could no longer remain in between. The choice would come sooner than he wished, and once it did, there would be no return. Elias Verden had always believed that betrayal was the worst wound a heart could endure. But when the final revelation came, he realized that pain had layers, and he had only been living on the surface of it. All along he had thought the cruelty was in being replaced, in the whispers and the lies, in the faces of those who had once called him their own turning toward another without hesitation. But there was more, something deeper that none of his confrontations had unearthed. It arrived not as an explosion, but as a quiet truth, slipping into his world like a shadow he could no longer ignore. It began with a name, mentioned carelessly in a conversation he wasn't meant to overhear. At first it seemed like nothing, a passing remark, a detail out of place. But the name carried weight, a thread that pulled at his memory, unraveling all the pieces he had been too blinded by grief to notice. He followed it, not out of choice but compulsion, tracing connections that should not have existed, uncovering ties between the stranger who had replaced him and those he had trusted most. Every step forward revealed a plan far more intricate than the betrayal he had already endured. He was not simply pushed aside for someone new. He had been marked, targeted, and quietly dismantled to make way for this replacement. The realization hit like ice in his veins. It had never been about drifting apart, never about his shortcomings, never even about the circle itself. It had been deliberate. Someone had orchestrated it, planting seeds of doubt, feeding the distance, until Elias was painted as unnecessary. They had not stumbled into his erasure, they had designed it. The betrayal was not just personal, it was systematic, and the one who now stood in his place had been waiting all along, stepping into a role built on Elias's ruin. The weight of it nearly broke him. To know that those he loved had not only abandoned him but had conspired against him shattered something deeper than trust. He thought of every moment he had doubted himself, every time he had questioned his worth, and realized it had all been manipulated, every silence and every cold glance carefully placed to drive him toward isolation. His pain had been crafted, his despair engineered. The cruelty of it was almost unbearable. And yet, in the heart of that devastation, something within Elias shifted. For weeks he had been torn between revenge and acceptance, drowning in the choice, unable to commit to either path. But the revelation cut through the fog, burning away the indecision. He saw the truth for what it was. He could never go back to who he was before, could never rebuild what had been deliberately destroyed. The choice was no longer between revenge and acceptance. It was between letting the betrayal define him, or defining himself in spite of it. Elias stood on the precipice of that decision, the image of his replacement etched in his mind, the echoes of his former circle haunting him. For the first time, the pain did not paralyze him, it clarified him. He understood now that he had been living in a story written by others, a story that ended with his erasure. But the revelation gave him something they had not anticipated, the chance to write his own ending. Whether through silence or fire, peace or destruction, he would no longer be a passive character in the life they had scripted for him. The final revelation had not broken him. It had freed him. And as Elias Verden stepped away from the ruins of what once was, he carried with him not just the scars of betrayal, but the dangerous, unyielding knowledge that the power to choose his path had always been his alone.